Welcome to the Bury Libraries podcast. The following podcast was recorded live on National Libraries Day 2016 at Whitefield Library and Adult Learning Centre. Connect with us online at www.bury.gov.uk/libraries or connect with us on social media. Please note, the following views belong to the members of the reading group as individuals and do not represent Bury Council or Bury Libraries. Sit back, relax and enjoy our Bury Libraries podcast.
Right, so we're here at Whitefield Library on National Libraries Day 2016 just to have a chat about our favourite books. So, would you like to start with yours?
Yeah, in 2006 I read just a lightweight book and it's often stuck in my mind. It was actually called The Looking Glass and it was by Michelle Roberts. Just a little book, never heard of her before, and it took place in a seaside town in Normandy in 1912. And Genevieve was a maid to a widowed bar owner, Madame Patin, and she cooked and she cleaned and gardened and served the customers together. And as she got older, she grew so beautiful, and in this little tiny town there was so much jealousy because in the bar the men used to chat to her and the owner of the bar was getting older and didn't like it. But what impressed me all these years with this book, I could describe this little cafe because the words she'd used, where every little thing was, the shelf, the seats were, and I was there, and that was it. And since then it's always stuck in. And after that I read another similar type thing called Witness. This was in 2014 and it was by Kath Stancliffe, and actually it was witnessing to a murder, a brutal murder in Manchester. And it was only 4 people and it was the 4 witnesses. One was a midwife, one was a white van driver, one was an unmarried girl, and I can't off the top of my head forget the other. But how it all came together, and it was on an estate. We all know a little estate, don't we? And it was so realistic, thoroughly enjoyed. And that's the sort of book that caught my attention. Probably never read those authors' books again, but that was it.
I was asked for a favourite book. I thought it was very difficult because I've been reading for over 70 years. And then I thought, well, I think my criteria will be programmes that I have seen recently on television and articles that I've read about encouraging young people to read. And as reading has been one of the most important things in my life, I felt I should try and choose a book that I thought would appeal to a wide range of people and that was comparatively easy to read. And so I chose a book that was published in 1949, and I read when I was a teenager, and it's called I Capture the Castle. It's by Dodie Smith. And in it, it's written in the first person by Cassandra, who's 17, and she wants to be a writer. And she lives in a dilapidated castle with her family, who are very poor. There's her sister, her stepmother Topaz, and her father, who is suffering from writer's block. And so it's quite a small world in 1949. They're quite isolated and poor, but it's an easy to read. The characters are all interesting, and I think it's a charming and funny book. And I gave it to my granddaughter to read, and she enjoyed it, and I can still, all these years later, still enjoy it myself.
Thank you.
Well, I don't have a particularly favourite book. I'd like to say that the book, one of the books that got me into reading was one my brother brought in when he was about 14. That's a long time ago. I can't tell you the author or the title, but basically it was set in an Italian village with a communist mayor having a row with the Catholic priest, and the antics they both get up to is so hilarious. Unfortunately, it's so long ago I can't remember the individual instance, but I believe they did make a film of one of the stories with Anthony Quinn in as the mayor, but apart from that I can't tell you anything. But I do like a variation of books from, this might sound daft coming from a man, romance right up to the war stories. I like all of that, and I love westerns, but you can't get them here in this library. Unfortunately.
Well, it looks like we might have an answer for you.
Is it Don Camillo? Is it Don Camillo? The
What?
Little World of Don Camillo?
It could, oh yeah, that's it.
The
You're
Catholic
right.
priest and thing. They did
Yes.
make a film of it. I'm not sure that there wasn't a French film of it as well.
Oh, I don't know, but that was one of the earliest books I can remember reading.
Yes.
And chuckling. And I still get the odd amusing book, comedy
Was
book.
very famous at the time.
Yes, it was, wasn't it?
Yes.
I couldn't think of her name. Because I was
I
on,
think that's
let's say it was 14.
Yes.
It's a long time ago.
He's only 15 now.
Yeah, you would think so. Yes. Very good.
Well, we have to write that down and see if we've got a copy that you can borrow.
Yeah.
So you can reread
Such a long
it.
time ago.
I've got it on tape so I can read it.
Yeah,
listen to
we'll
it
have a
as well.
look, yeah.
All fixed up here.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I think it's that one, but
It
sometimes
sounds
you
it, yeah.
get,
It
you
sounds,
get things
it does.
confused.
Yeah. You're right, I think you're right. Yeah.
Well, as you were saying earlier, it's really difficult to just pick one book. I mean, I had a quick look at my bookshelves this morning and I picked up 4. But that conversation has just reminded me of a similar conversation I had about 10 years ago when somebody was saying, I read this book and I can't remember what it was called or who it was by, and she started describing it, and it was The Talking Parcel by Gerald Durrell. And I don't know if you've ever read it, but that is one of my favourite books. He was a naturalist who wrote very, very funny stories about his expeditions to get particular animals and birds for his zoo in Jersey, because he'd always collected animals since he was a young boy. But the Talking Parcel is a bit different. It's the story of 4 children who go on a magical journey that starts with a train, and they end up in this really bizarre land full of mythical creatures like cockatrices and cork trees, where you just go to a tree and pick off your favourite size cork that you need for the bottle that you've got at the time. And they've got moon cows, which are like giant slugs, which have some sort of taps on their shells that you can get milk and maybe something else out of, I can't remember now. But the trail that they leave behind on the floor, you can pick it up and use it to make things. It's just such an incredible story. It's really, really good, and because it's him, he's got such a great touch. That's one of my favourite books. Yeah, so I've had the similar experience.
I vaguely remember that.
So
He had
that's,
a library,
that's 2 we should put
he
on our
had a
list.
zoo in Jersey.
He did,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes.
I thought of my family and other animals.
Yes, so did I.
Yes.
Yes.
Which is lovely.
Yeah. So many to choose from with him.
Yes.
I don't really want this, but there we are. I don't really have a favourite book. Some books make an impression on me and some don't. And the one that's made an impression recently is a book about Wallis Simpson by Rebecca Dean. Wallis Simpson I can remember, but I can't remember. All I can remember is the media and the things they said about her. She was divorced and whatever. But at the end of this book, I really felt sorry for her, and I thought she'd had a raw deal. It didn't, in the media, it didn't mention that her first husband beat her nearly to death. And it really made me think of royalty and you know, how the media really misinforms people about people's lives. and I did enjoy it, but it did make a big impression on me.
I like books that are set in, say, a different country, or where so you get, you know, apart from the actual story, you're getting a lot of background information. And a couple of the books that I've really enjoyed were by Khaled Hossein, who wrote The Kite Runner, and then 100,000 Princes, I think it's called, and absolutely set in Afghanistan. And, you know, I found them so, the way that they portrayed the Taliban, you know, these awful people. And of course it's so sort of topical anyway, you know, this sort of thing. And I thought they were absolutely brilliant books, the whole background and the way women, particularly the second one, The 100,000 Princes, about the life of women in that country. So I thoroughly enjoyed those. More recently, this wasn't so much a background bit, but it's recently been made into a film, but the actual book, Room, I found that absolutely fascinating because it's about a woman who was kidnapped when she was 19, raped, and she had a little boy, and he kept her in prison for 7 years. Now, there's been a lot of these going around over the last few years. It is a novel, but I think it's written by Emma Donoghue, and she's obviously researched into it. But what I found fascinating about that was the psychological side of it, because this little boy was brought up in a small room where there was just a kitchen, a bathtub, and a wardrobe and a bed. And the guy that imprisoned them used to come every night, and the little boy would have to sleep in the wardrobe. And it's just his relationship with his mother, and also his idea of reality. You know, they get away in the end, but it really fascinated me, the psychological side of it. The fact that he was never outside these sort of four walls, and that was him. He called it room, not even the room, it was room, and he got to see a little bit of TV, and it was just absolutely fascinating. So I like those kind of books that just a bit different, you know, they're, you know, with a different type of background.
I was so depressed and upset. Yeah. I've never been able to read The Kite Runner. And the man who's so awful to those women, I mean, he's not even an extremist, is he? He's just an ordinary man who exploits them. And that poor little girl sort of serving the men their food and then sent up to her room where she sits. She's nothing to read or anything. She's just like some poor little servant. I found it terribly upsetting. And I think it's influenced me very much on immigration issues. You know, because you catch little bits in the paper of girls who, well, there was one quite recently, a dumb girl, who was used as a sex object and a slave by people. Yes. And I found it terribly depressing. Would I find the other one,
The Kite Runner,
would I find that as depressing?
No, it is different, The Kite Runner. You know, but it's a really good story, and it's the parallel lives of the main character and the young Muslim lad who was his friend when they were little boys, and it's really interesting. But I mean, I can't remember in which of the books, was it The Kite Runner or the other one, where they described this sort of football pitch, and a couple who supposedly in their eyes committed adultery were put into a pit and stoned to death. I mean, it was barbaric. But I mean, you know, what's new these days, you know, with what's going on, you know, that's this was before IS you know, came to light, and this was just like the Taliban, and you just think how totally barbaric can it be?
This is quite. There was a case only in the papers only a couple of years ago of a young girl. I think she was about 14 or 15, and she'd had sexual relations with her uncle, and they were going to stone her to death. And I don't know whether public opinion stopped it, but you never heard of anything happening to the man. No. And you must have thought, in that case, it must have been an older man preying on a young girl.
Yeah, of course.
And that's the background. I mean, chopping people's hands off and things like that. Yeah. I mean, that is the background of people coming to this country, which I find disturbing. I'm sure, I mean, lots of people are not like that, but it's there, isn't it?
It's the custom, though, isn't it? It's women are there just to do things.
Yes.
They're not as here on equal levels.
No.
And it'll take. I mean, how long has it taken us to get like this?
Yes.
But there's some excellent books on these sort of subjects, like you've just named them, The Kite Runner, where you've got rich boy, poor boy living together in the same house, and how they treat and how he treats his friend, and remorse, and it pulls on you, but it's wonderful.
It is.
You laugh, you cry,
Yes.
you can feel the dust and the dirt.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, perhaps
I like books
perhaps I'll
where
pick up Charlotte Curry
go
and
for
read it.
them. Brick Lane's another
Yes.
one.
Yes.
Monica,
Yes,
you know, they're
I've had that one.
it's opening your door and looking on the world, isn't it?
But I think it is in terms of women as well. It sounds as if I'm a tremendous woman slipper. Not really. I'm too old for that. But what you were saying about the book about Wallace Simpson is interesting, because the press liked to present, or they did particularly in those days, a woman was either a saint or a whore, wasn't she?
Yeah.
And that's what made the
I'm saying.
news.
It really made
Yes.
me think
Yeah.
about it.
Yes.
She didn't have the life.
Yes.
So, yeah. She ended up married and happy, but to get to there was a lot of things happening.
It's woman as an object, isn't
And,
it?
you know, her upbringing wasn't very good. But again, it was against the wealthy people to the poor, you know, the poorer people. And it really doesn't stress that. Her husband really did, her first husband really, really beat her up. He nearly killed
He was
her.
an alcoholic.
No, he was, he was an alcoholic, and they lived on an air base. He was a sergeant, and he couldn't get any further in the Air Force because of his drinking. His colleagues covered it up. But in the end, he did some horrible things to her. And like you say about these other people, the world, I don't know whether it's a good thing you get to know about what's going on in the world and all the horrible things, because it makes you appreciate your own family and things, but it is the media. It's the media that plant all these ideas in your head.
We have to learn how to pick out the good and the bad and the indifferent.
When I was, I say, a teenager, I thought it was so romantic that the king would give up his throne. You know, for a woman, I thought it was great. Now my mother, this was in Aberdeen, she had a different slant in this, because the king, which Edward the what, 7th was it?
Yeah.
Yeah, was supposed to be opening the new hospital, which had been, it was from public funds. You know, the people of Aberdeen basically paid for the new Royal Infirmary, and the king was supposed to be opening it, and he pulled out at the last minute. And it was said that it was because he was off with Wallace Simpson, so somewhere. And of course, the people were absolutely, really, really annoyed. So that was her slant in it. But, you know, when you hear about, you know, the kind of life she's had, it does show you sometimes. That,
It just printed her as
yeah.
a socialite that was
Yes.
looking for further up the ladder. And it wasn't.
They wanted to blame the woman, didn't they?
Yeah.
And not him.
And he was a woman.
I think he was a little waster, really.
He was
Yeah.
nothing.
He was a woman,
He was an absolute nothing.
And I think we were well rid of him, really.
Definitely.
But they had to blame her, didn't they, really?
That's what I'm saying.
Well,
Everything was
yes.
blamed on her, and I mean, no doubt she.
Since the war has ended and he's died, there's a lot of things come out about him.
Oh, definitely.
About how it was a good thing he didn't become king,
Yes.
because he was very fond of the Nazis.
Yes.
Hey, there was a lot of covering up,
Yes.
wasn't there?
Yes.
I mean, there's been a lot still not said.
The book, Dodie Smith, she lived in Whitefield.
Did she?
Yes, yes.
Did she?
Yeah.
She was quite in the 1930s.
Yeah.
I think she moved in that set because she
Yeah.
wrote a famous play, didn't she?
Yeah, she
Something
wrote
about a
The
family.
Dalmatians. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, that's the Dodie
Yes.
Smith, yes.
I think she
I
was.
don't think it's Whitefield.
I think she was a member of the Smart Set, Noel Coward,
Yeah.
and people like that in
Yeah.
the 1930s.
Yeah.
You know, all those smart people
Yeah.
who were sort of writing plays and acting and things like that. and I think she was a member of that set as well.
And she buzzed off to America and then she came back. You know, she was... Yeah,
She-
good.
she had-
Her father actually was a bank manager in Whitefield. I think it's great. I've tried to find out because one of the books said the name of the house, like Inglenook or something, and whenever I'm going round Whitefield looking at the older houses, I look on the stump
do
and I've still
you?
not found it.
Ah,
Yeah, and he was a bank manager in Whitefield. And I'm thinking, oh, and if they're Nat West or...
she was enormously successful,
Yeah,
wasn't
she was. Yeah, very diverse in her writing.
It's interesting when you were talking about like local places, because
Yeah.
when I was asked to think about like one of my favourite books, I think like us all find it really difficult to just narrow it down to one. And a book that I read in 2015, I think that was massively significant for me in that I kind of had got to the stage where I was bored of reading the same things. I think you find your niche, don't you, and you home in on it because we're all creatures of habit, aren't we? We don't want to experience new things. And it's the same thing with, food, isn't it? I always look at the Chinese menu, and yet I order the same dishes every time, but I still want to see the menu, just in case, I feel risky, which has never happened, but might do. And I think it's the same with books, but one of my friends wrote a book, he wrote a trilogy of books, and he's a lad he's from a slightly different background from me. He's from a very wealthy background, but he grew up in Bolton, like I have done. And I really found, he gave me these books at football training one night, and I thought, very obliged to read them. And so there was no kind of escape of, well, this isn't usually the kind of thing I would read. Had to read it because he's my friend. And I'd escaped it long enough, as one of my other friends had said, because he had read them all a year ago. So I started to read this book, and it's called The Baby and the Brandy. And it's a strange book in that it's... the title of the book doesn't really seem to have any significance until right at the end, and you kind of think I'm reading this and I'm enjoying it, but there's lots of pieces that don't seem to fit together. And I think one of my favourite things about it is that it's set in Manchester, and so the description is so vivid, and I think it's so accurate. And obviously, living very close to Manchester and spending a lot of time in Manchester, you can kind of... I half wondered, was it cheating? Because is it just triggering my imagination of, I've walked down these streets 1,000 times. But I actually spoke to one of my friends who lives in London. I gave him the copy of the book, and he's never been down these streets. And he said how good the description was. So that was really helpful. And it's full of mystery, this book. It starts with a man who's escaped from strange ways. We don't know why. We don't actually find out in the first book at all why. It's almost like you just have to jump in and join in with that. But it really looks at these themes. It surrounds this character called Benjamin Bracken, and the trilogy is all about Benjamin Bracken. And the thing with Benjamin Bracken is we start to learn bits about him, and he's an ex-army officer, but for some reason he's been disgraced, and it kind of explores this idea of where the line is between criminals and those that protect us. And as a person, I'm quite fascinated by that line. A lot of the things I watch and read can be about that, about how, what separates somebody who is completely evil and those kind of geniuses who are brilliant detectives, and how close that is, and, having to think like those people that do horrendous things, and actually how that's, very difficult to do. And it's actually, I personally found it a fantastic book, partly because of the local side to it, but I just found it was a book that I couldn't put down. It was so different in some ways to what I'd read, and I was quite shocked because obviously I'm in the privileged position of being able to talk to the guy who wrote it. So I met with my friend Robert and talked about it, and he said I read it all in a night. I just couldn't put it down, which wasn't great because I was working the next day, and it got very late. But it was something that I just couldn't put down, physically couldn't do it. And when I spoke to him, he was telling me about how a lot of what he spoke about, it seemed a bit far-fetched, some of it. It was about the gang culture in Worsley. And obviously, Worsley's quite a well-to-do place in my mind, so I couldn't really understand this. But it was actually, he pulled out all these newspaper articles, and it was all true. And he based all of these gangs on real events that had happened. And the moment, it seemed quite far-fetched, but because you had this backdrop of Manchester and the description was so vivid, I bought into it in a way that I wouldn't usually. I'm not usually into things that seem far-fetched. I think if something suddenly does something and I think, oh, that's ridiculous, it's lost me, completely lost me, I can't cope with it. But this book, you know, dived into this world that I didn't understand, and I found it really fascinating. And yeah, I asked him for the next book the next week, and I read that very quickly as well. And that was based in London and goes around the Savoy and places like that, which are places I hadn't been, but then I went to visit them, and his description is absolutely excellent. And I think for a first effort, I mean, he's been published because of it, but he's done an excellent job. It's the first book he's ever written, and it's fantastic. So
Have you the third one? Have you read
the third one, he has sent me an electronic copy of it because he's now been published. He's had to destroy. He published the books himself in the beginning, and he's now been bought by, well, he's been signed by a publisher, so he's had to get rid of all of his copies of the books because he's not allowed them anymore. So he couldn't give me a print copy of it because it was his latest one. He'd only just finished it, so he sent me an electronic version of it. My problem is that I don't have the capacity to read it at the moment, and I'm not a big fan of reading on screens. So I feel like I should read it, but I might wait for the print to arrive.
Well, what's his full name?
So he's called Robert Parker as well, but it's not to be confused with the Robert Parker. But yeah, no, he's called Robert Parker, and he's written these 3 books. And in fact, was it last year or the year before, he was the 5th most downloaded. His Baby and the Brandy was the 5th most downloaded thriller on Amazon, on the Kindle store. So he just put it out there for free, and people have gone crazy for it.
Tremendously hard though to get 3 books.
Yeah, he did his knee playing football, and he had to have an operation. He couldn't walk for 6 months, so he's got 2 young children, but he couldn't really. He was limited to what he could do with them, so he just spent his time writing.
I see.
And he said that it had been something that he'd been inspired by years ago.
Yes.
And so he'd been writing things down throughout the last couple of years, and then he just put it all together when he'd done his knee in. So yeah, I really enjoyed it. Yeah, I thought it was fantastic.
Do you think he's got other books in him? You know.
I think that's the killer, isn't it? He's had this character, he's followed it through, but I have not read the final book yet, but I believe that is the final book. That will be the end of, whether it's the end of Benjamin Bracken, but it's certainly the end of the trilogy.
Yes.
I think that's the difficulty then, isn't it? To recreate, to adapt again. He's certainly got the skills, it's whether he's got the inspiration, I guess, to do that.
Different character, yeah.
I was just reading, this is why I was a bit late, I always have to go up and get the Saturday Telegraph, and in the review there, they have articles about writers. I have no talent myself writing anything imaginative, so I'm always interested. And there was a man the other week, I forget his name now, but I was going to look for him on the shelves, and he apparently been writing for quite a long time, and he's suddenly got this character, and he's a detective in Brighton.
All right.
And I can't think of his name, but apparently they've taken off. And this happened after he'd been writing for quite a while. It was like you were saying, you know, sort of just getting that. And that has made him very successful.
Yeah. I think that's the difficulty though, isn't it, then, to come back with something fresh. There's an anticipation, isn't there, then, and an expectation.
Yes.
That you're going to be able to, you know, become like Mr. Patterson and just churn out book after book after book.
Yes. Well, that's the trouble. You have too much competition by somebody who churns out.
Yeah.
But they have the avid following.
Yes.
They like churned out.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And to start, we had a young man here, another writer in Whitefield, we're brilliant, Whitefield, and came in and gave a talk to the reading group, and I've just looked in my diary, it was in my other diary, can't think of his name, and it took place in the old Yugoslav area, which he seems to have connections via his wife. It was intriguing, absolutely intriguing.
Was it the road edition?
Yes,
That's
something
it.
like that.
Yes, brilliant.
Yes.
And when you were talking about the book, The Room, the author came and she spoke at Bury, and we all went.
Oh.
And she signed copies. She came from Canada, but it
That's
was
right,
great.
Irish-Canadian, I think.
Yeah, it
isn't
was a
she?
really good evening.
Ah, I bet.
Yeah.
I'd love to have gone to that.
Yeah.
You know, you were saying about, you know, when somebody writes about, say, Manchester, and you know, because you know the area.
Yeah.
I found an author, Stuart McBride, he's from Aberdeen, but his first book was called Cold Granite, and I thought, oh, I've got to read this because it was set in Aberdeen, and it was great because every place he mentioned, I knew it. And but what's frustrating is that he's actually become. I've heard he was on the radio the other day actually, so he's written more books, but. It appears that the only one that's come out on audio is Cold Granite, which is really annoying. It was why it was just the first one, I don't know, and that's the problem sometimes. The audiobooks come out usually quite a bit after the print books, but they don't all come on audio, you know. So it's really, really annoying when that happens.
So, I mean, if you take I think it was Trollope, if you took the Palliser novels and the the ones about the clergy,
That's a lot of reading.
it's a tremendous amount,
Yes,
isn't
yes.
it?
But generally speaking, it's quite a small percentage of books that are produced.
Is it?
There's obviously there's the downloadable ones now and the electronic ones, but actually on CD, which is.
I was getting quite attracted to the idea of having one on when I was lying in bed before I went to sleep. I thought it would be rather nice to listen to somebody reading it.
And the good thing about audiobooks is that you can actually, apart from vacuuming, you can actually
go around the house.
You can go around the house going about. I do that all the time, you know. I'll move from one room to another, and I just bring the CD player or the Sovereign player, which does the pen drives. Just bring it round with me. So it's great. You've always got it, and I've a terrible habit. I do drop off to sleep, but funny enough, it's always quite at night time if you're listening to it. But I'm always able to just go back a track at a time, and very quickly I can almost put to the word where I've fallen asleep. It's funny that, yeah.
You should have the Daisy player because you have a knob on that plays it for half an hour and then it turns itself off.
Oh really?
Yeah.
That's a newer version. I have got a one of these players, but with
The
it
only
only
problem is the disc you get from the RNIB will not play on anything else, but you can play anything else.
on it. Yeah,
on
that's
it.
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
MP3.
But they do have a.
Yeah.
Because it took me ages to realise what it was.
Well, I know when talking about young people, and that was sort of something I was thinking a lot about. I remember my nephew, he didn't read much, but his mother worked in the library, and he listened to a talking book every night.
Yeah.
So it's not exactly
Well,
reading,
like
but it's on
listening
the
to
way,
radio,
isn't it?
Yes.
It's like listening to a play on the radio.
They're so well read.
Yeah.
And they really are. And quite often they're well-known people that read them, you know,
Yes.
actors or actresses, you know, and they are good.
Have a good voice,
Yeah.
you know, to do the
Oh,
parts.
Yeah.
You got a good one, didn't you? When you could hear the traffic going by.
Oh,
That was the thing, wasn't it?
oh.
Hello,
Yeah,
mate.
And it was reading it and you could hear trains and all sorts going at the back of it.
I mean, they were, not the Calibre Learning Library. A lot of it was done by volunteers, but no disrespect. But they weren't, generally speaking, as polished as the.
They didn't have the good
Professional
studio
ones.
and the
No.
editing.
How do you think the library's going to progress? You know, when you look back, when I was born in Whitefield, and the library used to be opposite John Slattery's. There's a row of big terraced houses. The children's library was up the stairs and the adults was down. And then, of course, we got to this and the books went. Now you have the reading books, you have all these things. I wonder what's next. It's very interesting,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Well, we had at the Macular meeting yesterday, we had Elizabeth Binns, which is you.
Well, the head of libraries, yeah.
And she was telling us about what happens in libraries now. It's not only your books, is it? It's people coming in with disabilities and help. And she was actually telling us about one library they've opened on, not Dicky Bird Estate, what's the estate that's near it?
Stopping forward.
Yeah. And she said they went for a meeting and they were rude, really rude, and said they didn't want anything. But they still have the library. But they do have advise people that enter the queue is that long.
That's what
It
you
takes
need.
all day. So they're not only dealing in books now, you're dealing in a lot
You're
of other
paying your
things.
rates, you're getting your citizens' advice, and
Yeah.
it's all under one roof.
I think the key with libraries, though, is the history of libraries
Mm.
was about equipping those that couldn't. It was about giving a chance to those that were uneducated.
Yeah.
And part of that was about reading, obviously, which was a key for
Yeah.
it, and because books were so expensive. But that's the heart, really, isn't it, that we want to, surely, that we would like to see with libraries, to continue to give those a chance that don't have a chance. But obviously, books have been a
But
huge
there's a
part
big
of it.
battle now, isn't there? That children don't necessarily need to learn to read a book. They can go on computer. They know the computers. It's like studying at school. They don't study like I used to study. They bring it up on a computer, take what they want out of it, and that's that subject finished. It's a different world altogether.
It is, unfortunately. But I mean, I just think that book groups are so good because as somebody was saying before, you end up with a book and you think, oh, I wouldn't have picked that one, or and it's different. So you do read. It makes you read, or in our case, listen to books that you wouldn't otherwise have chosen. And I think that's really good because it is this thing about your comfort zone. You know what you like, and you think, oh no.
Well, it's like your menu, like this young man
Yes.
was saying, he always goes back to what he's familiar with. But Anna will tell you, I mean, she's a newcomer and she's fitted in absolutely brilliant because she's interested in books. We start off and somebody will say, oh, I thought it was absolutely rotten, rubbish.
That was my
load of rubbish."
the first person who spoke. Never read so much rubbish in my life.
It's got 5 star. And you think, I miss that. And it makes you look a bit deeper into things, and it widens your horizon.
Yes.
And that's what life is.
I hate giving up on a book.
Yeah.
I'm very, very seldom, even if I'm not keen on it. I think I could count on the fingers of one hand when I've just thought, oh, I can't cope with this anymore. I really, really don't like it. Because I always think you get something from it, even if it's not necessarily your cup of tea. And so very rarely do I give up on it. I agree with you.
Yes. Everybody kept saying how wonderful Captain Corelli's violin was, or mandolin, or whatever it was. And eventually, my sister had given me a copy, and I read it, and I did stick it to the very end, and I thought, I've never read so much rubbish in my life. I hated it.
Yeah.
And I felt out of step with everybody else, but I really disliked it. I kept on going to the end. I was sort of glad I did.
Well, it's like life. We don't all have to eat the same pudding, do we?
No.
That's, I don't eat puddings at all.
And it's usually the book that you start with thinking, oh, it's going to be boring.
Yes.
That you really get interested in and you learn something.
Yeah.
I think when you read a book, you learn something as you're going along, even though it doesn't apply to you. It sticks in your mind.
I'm heartened when I hear you speaking because you're a very young man, and it's very nice, that you're a reader. You're playing football as well, and I think my youngest son is 49 now, I think, but he's the same. I mean, he sports, but he was always a great reader, and I think it's very heartening to know that young people still are like that.
But if you trace it back, you know why he's a good reader. Because when he was little, before he went to sleep, you were always read. Well, I presume you were read to. Always,
Yes.
always.
Yes.
And my family have done it with theirs and the next generation, and they're always reading. And
Yes.
I mean, my granddaughter's 15 now, and up until about 3 years ago, she just read everything that was going, and she was read to. But now she doesn't read very much, but I think it's just the age she's at. And I like to think that hopefully she'll come back to it, because I think you do go through phases. I mean, I was an avid reader when I was a child. I used to get 7 books out a week from the mobile library. And my mother was a great reader, and she read to me. And then I read everything. And then I think into my 20s or whatever, didn't stop reading. This is when I could see. I just didn't seem to... I got out of the habit of reading, and then you went to college and there was too much other stuff going on, and blah, 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 blah. But what brought
they
me...
are the downfall sometimes. men, aren't they, when you're trying to get on?
But there has been a survey, hasn't there, about children and lads. Boys usually stop reading round about the age of 12.
Yes, yes.
And girls are 14.
Yes.
But it's understandable because from the age of 13 to 17, it's very hard for growing up, whether
It's
you're a
like
boy or
riding
a girl.
bike, you never forget. You come back to it. You know, when you go on a journey, you've always got a little book of some sort, haven't you? Especially when we go on holidays, we take some of the books we buy from here and leave them in the hotel, and it, you know, you're passing it on.
And sometimes you think your children aren't reading. I mean, my son is 43 now, but when he was, 9 or 10, he wanted this magazine, weekly magazine on rock and roll. And I never saw him read it. And I bought it him for about 12 months. And I thought, I'm stopping this, I've never seen him read it. But you ask him any question on rock and roll,
Remembers it.
and he knew it all. And he had read it, but not in front of me.
Yeah.
I think the television in the bedroom is a thing.
I don't have one.
I think when children, particularly
Can't
for
see it,
children,
that's why.
if they go to bed and
Yeah.
they can write or read or
Yeah.
do some drawing or anything but television.
Do kids still have a torch under the duvet reading?
No, they've got a light on their mobile phone. Yeah. So they don't need the torch.
I used to buy my grandchildren things like that, and I said, "What's that for?" I said, "For reading under the duvet." Just for a laugh. They think it's funny, and they do. They read under the duvet because it's funny.
Does anybody remember the Boots used to have a library?
I was just speaking
yeah.
about that
Yes.
the other day.
And you could get an A subscription or a B subscription. And the A subscription, and you got it was a long sort of rectangular, like laminated bookmark thing, you know. And the obviously the A subscription is more expensive, but that entitled you to get newer books. Or the B one, you know, you got the older ones. But it used to be a kind of a Christmas present sometimes. My mother would get an A subscription to the library, and I'd be going in and getting the B books. It's funny, it seems, yeah.
People, I mentioned it the other day, Boots Library.
Yeah.
And it must have been during the war, because my father wasn't there, and my mother and my little sister, and it was upstairs in Boots, in Headington, in Oxford, near Oxford. And you were surprised,
Yes,
wasn't
haven't
it?
heard of it.
I've never heard of it.
Yes.
Well, that was in the 50s, you know, because that was the one in Aberdeen, and it was the first shop I ever went into that had what we used to call funny stairs. It was an escalator.
Oh, yes. So that's quite far north. I was beginning to wonder when you said you didn't know about it. I wondered if it was just a southern thing, but obviously it wasn't.
It might be the type of area for how many local libraries.
Yes.
there are.
Well, no, in the 50s where I grew up in Moss Side,
Yeah,
there was about 4 or 5 sweet shops, cigarettes.
yeah.
They started having their own little libraries.
Oh, yes.
Right.
I think it was 6 months to take one out for juniors, and I think it was a shilling for grown-ups.
Yes.
You got your shilling back when you took the book back, or your sixpence.
Yes.
So if you didn't take it back, you lost your sixpence or your shilling.
Yes.
And it was about, I think it must have been about 6 shops. They were all paperbacks, man,
Yes.
and
Yes.
they were all second-hand, obviously. But
I think Huddersfield had one called the Red Circle Library.
I don't know.
And I think that would be a shop,
Yeah.
like you were saying, who sort of set up their own little library.
I mean, where it came from, I don't know, because this particular sweet shop was right across from where we live. And I used to go over quite often, and then all of a sudden, these books were there. What's this? See, what's the library? They take, you know, well, they didn't have to say it in my name, he knew me, but it's 6 months if you want to borrow one.
So he was
So
not
go back home, get
wasn't
6
he?
months and go. Book.
Why didn't your dad start one of Wonderfish?
Oh yeah, it would have been
Brought
well
in a
that, wouldn't
greengrocer's
it?
shop.
Well, thank you all very much for coming and talking about books and libraries and